Bharatiya Model of Inclusive Development (BMID), a comprehensive analytical essay. Introduction Evolution of India's Developmental Paradigm. The Bharatiya Model of Inclusive Development represents a structured articulation of India's emerging development philosophy in the 21st century. The framework attempts to reconcile growth with equity, markets with social responsibility, and the state intervention with private enterprise. The policy approach emphasizes the integration of indigenous institutional evolution with modern economic theory, forming a hybrid model distinct from both Western laissez-faire capitalism and state-dominated socialist planning traditions. The policy paper argues that India's development trajectory has been shaped not only by theoretical frameworks but also by real-world crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic and global oil shocks, which tested economic resilience and institutional flexibility. The Indian development model has gradually shifted from a rigid, centralized planning approach towards a dynamic framing, emphasizing private initiative, empowerment of citizens, and adaptive pragmatism. Rather than following a single ideological blueprint, the model incorporates iterative policy learning, institutional adaptation, and context-specific innovation. This evolutionary characteristic is presented as a defining feature distinguishing India's approach from rigid doctrinal models applied in other economies. The slogan "Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Sabka Vishwas, and Sabka Prayas" symbolizes the political economic philosophy underlying the model, emphasizing collective participation, trust-based governance, and distributed responsibilities in development processes. Historical context: from state-led development to hybrid market systems, India's development trajectory since independence can be divided into multiple structural phases, beginning with centralized planning influenced by socialist economic doctrine. In the decades following independence, state ownership of strategic industries, import substitution, industrialization, and bureaucratic allocation mechanisms dominated economic policymaking. While these policies aimed to promote industrial self-sufficiency and reduce dependence on colonial trade structures, they also generated inefficiencies due to rigid controls, lack of competitive incentives, and bureaucratic distortions. Over time, empirical evidences indicated that excessive state control limited innovation, productive growth, and entrepreneurial dynamism. Gradual liberalization policies initiated in the late 20th century reflected recognition of structural inefficiencies associated with government monopolies. The policy paper emphasizes that government monopoly over economic activity tends to generate suboptimal outcomes due to misaligned incentive structures inherent in bureaucratic systems. The transition towards market-oriented reforms doesn't imply complete abandonment of the welfare role of the state. Instead, the emerging model sought to maintain public responsibility for social equity while enabling competition market structure to drive productive growth. The coexistence of public institution support and private sector dynamism is positioned as a defining structural characteristics of the Bharatiya development paradigm. Core conceptual framework, the three pillars of BMID. From a development economics perspective, the Bharatiya model of inclusive development is structured around three core pillars: market economics, empowerment, and pragmatism. These pillars function not as independent policy components but as mutually reinforcing institutional logics, shaping policy designs and implementation. The integration of these pillars aims to generate sustained economic growth while maintaining distributive fairness and institutional adaptability. The framework implicitly recognizes that long-term development outcomes depend on both economic efficiency and social legitimacy. Indic market economy, competition as the engine of growth. The concept of an Indic market economy reflects the belief that private initiative and competitive markets serve as primary drivers of economic growth and employment generation. The model recognizes the role of entrepreneurship, capital formation, and technological innovation in expanding productive capacity and improving living standards. Business enterprises, including corporations, micro, small, and medium enterprises, informal sector participants, and self-employed individuals, are recognized as essential contributors to national economic dynamism. The policy framework acknowledges that economic diversity across regions, sectors, and institutional forms requires flexible regulatory environments capable of supporting heterogeneous economic actors. Rather than viewing the private sector solely as a profit-maximizing entity, the model conceptualizes business as an integral component of National development infrastructure. Firms are treated as institutional actors embedded within social and regional contexts, contributing to employment generation, technological diffusion, and productivity enhancement. The government's role is defined primarily as enabling rather than substituting private initiative. Policy instruments include regulatory simplification, infrastructure investment, financial inclusion, institutional reform aimed at reducing transaction costs, increasing market accessibility. The approach reflects a recognition that economic growth requires institutional ecosystems that support risk taking, capital accumulation, and innovation. Empowerment as a developmental multiplier. Empowerment constitutes the second pillar of the Bharatiya model of inclusive development, emphasizing the importance of expanding individual capabilities and access to opportunities. The framework suggests that inclusive growth requires not only income expansion but also improvements in human capital and financial inclusion. Digital access and institutional participation. Empowerment operates as a multiplier effect within the development process by increasing the productive potential of individuals and communities. Investments in education, health, skill development, and financial inclusion enhance labor productivity and reduce structural inequalities that constrain long term growth potential. The empowerment framework also reflects recognition that economic development cannot be sustained solely through macroeconomic growth indicators. Distributional inclusivity is necessary to maintain political legitimacy and social cohesion, both of which influence economic stability and investment incentives. Policies promoting digital identity systems, financial inclusion programs, and direct benefit transfers illustrate institutional mechanisms through which empowerment objectives are operationalized. These instruments reduce leakage in welfare distribution system while increasing efficiency in public resource allocation. Pragmatism in policy design and implementation. The third pillar of the Bharatiya model of inclusive development is pragmatism, which emphasizes flexibility, experimentation, and evidence based policy adoption. Pragmatism rejects ideological rigidity and instead prioritizes policy outcomes based on empirical effectiveness. Pragmatic policymaking involves iterative evolution of policy interventions and adjustments based on observed performance metrics. Rather than adhering to a predetermined doctrinal framework, the model encourages adaptive governance capability of responding to changing global economic conditions, technological disruptions, and domestic structural changes. This adaptive orientation reflects recognition that development strategies must evolve in response to dynamic constraints such as globalization, climate change, demographic shifts, and technological transformation. Pragmatism also implies policy heterogeneity across sectors and regions, acknowledging that uniform policy prescriptions may generate suboptimal outcomes in diverse socio-economic contexts. Institutional architecture and governance mechanisms. The Bharatiya model of inclusive development relies on a complex institutional architecture, combining central coordination with decentralized implementation. Federal structure allows policy experimentation across states, generating policy competition and innovation. Institutional reforms aimed at improving governance efficiency focus on transparency, accountability, and reduction to bureaucratic friction. Digitalization of administrative processes, simplification of regulatory compliance, and integration of data-driven governance mechanism enhance institutional responsiveness. The policy framework recognizes that governance capability constitutes a critical development, critical determinant of developmental outcomes. Institutional quality influences investment flows, business confidence, and social trust, all of which affect economic performance. Economic resilience and crisis response. Recent global crises have highlighted the importance of economic resilience as a component of development strategy. The COVID-19 pandemic and global commodity price shocks demonstrated the necessity of maintaining policy flexibility and institutional redundancy. Resilience-oriented policymaking includes diversification of supply chains, investment in domestic manufacturing capabilities, and strengthening of financial stability mechanisms. The Bharatiya development model incorporates resilience as a strategic objective, recognizing that economic shocks can reverse developmental gains if institutional buffers are insufficient. Macroeconomic stability, fiscal prudence, and strategic industrial policy contribute to resilience by reducing vulnerability to external disruptions. Inclusive growth and social stability. Inclusive growth is positioned both as an economic and political objective. economic inequality can generate social instability, reducing investment incentives, undermining long-term development projects. The Bharatiya model of inclusive development emphasizes broad-based participation in economic growth processes, ensuring that development benefits are distributed across socio-economic groups, geographic regions, and demographic categories. Social inclusion enhances aggregate demand, increasing human capital formation, and reduces structural poverty traps. By integrating inclusion with growth strategy, the model seeks to create a virtuous cycle between productivity expansion and welfare improvement. Comparative perspective distinction from Western and socialist models. The Bharatiya model framework differs from classical Western capitalist model by emphasizing distributive inclusivity and social responsibility. At the same time, it diverges from socialist models by prioritizing market demand resource allocation. Private sector participation and hybrid structure reflects recognition from both market failure and government failure can generate inefficiencies. The model attempts to balance corrective state intervention with competitive market mechanisms. Unlike rigid ideological frameworks, the Bharatiya model emphasizes contextual adaptation and policy pluralism. Role of technology and digital infrastructure. Technological infrastructure plays a central role in enabling inclusive development. Digital governance systems reduce administrative inefficiencies, enhance financial inclusion, and improve delivery of public systems. Digital identity systems, electronic payments infrastructure, and data integration platforms reduce information asymmetries and transaction costs, as well as it increases economic efficiency. Technology also enhances Technology also enhances transparency and reduces corruption by minimizing discretionary decision making with administrative systems. Long-term strategic vision. The Bharatiya model of inclusive development represents an attempt to construct a sustainable development framework capable of adapting to changing domestic and global conditions. The model recognizes that development is a continuous process requiring institutional evolution, policy innovation, and strategic foresight. Long-term objectives include structural transformation of the economy, expansion of high productivity sectors, reduction of poverty, and enhancement of global economic competitiveness. The integration of market efficiency, social inclusion, and adaptive governance constitutes the central strategic logic of the framework. Conclusion. Structural logic of the Bharatiya developmental paradigm. The Bharatiya model of inclusive development represents a synthesis of economic efficiency, social equity, and political pragmatism. By integrating market-driven growth with empowerment-oriented social policy, the framework seeks to generate sustainable, inclusive development outcomes. The model emphasizes that development strategies must be context-sensitive, institutionally grounded, and dynamically adaptive. The combination of entrepreneurial dynamism, human capability expansion, and pragmatic governance constitutes the operational architecture of the framework. Rather than presenting a static blueprint, the Bharatiya model of inclusive development functions as an evolving paradigm reflecting continuous learning from domestic experience and global economic transformations.